Good morning.
Good morning.
This is not going to be your standard Earth Day sermon, because, well, it's me. But also because it's you. And you don't need to be reminded or told that the Earth matters and that God cares about things and there's some connection between your faith and the state of the Earth and the way you should be living. This is all stuff you know already. The other reason it's not going to be a standard Earth Day sermon is because we live in West Virginia. And it's not a surprise to any West Virginian that if you pour all sorts of garbage into the water becomes undrinkable. This is not news to anybody that lives in this state as far as I know. So we're sort of starting well down the road in this sermon. We also need to acknowledge, before we go any further, the reality of Christian history, which is often not really good on the issue of Earth Day. That so often in the church we've operated with this idea of manifest destiny, that we at least as male Europeans, have the right to rule over the world and to have dominion over it, like we read. And we provided all sorts of theological and ideological smokescreen to the plundering of the earth and the destruction of the land and all of this horrible stuff that has gone on and continues to go on around us. And so the history of the church is certainly not all roses and joy in all of this. And part of this comes straight to us from out of the scriptures, right? So we read Genesis 1:28, right? Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion. And all of these pieces that can easily be used to explain why it is that we can remove the top of this mountain, and that's just fine because we're having dominion and filling the earth and subduing it. Yes, it's looking increasingly subdued, but that's our job, so why shouldn't we do this? But as, again, most of you know, there isn't just one creation story in Genesis, there are two. And the second creation story in Genesis 2 and 3 has a very different understanding of the relationship between us as human beings and the rest of the created order. That Genesis 2 and 3 tell us that we're really just part of this whole thing. And that our task here is to tend. Our task is to care for. Our task is a lot of work rather than dominion. And so it's a very different kind of story. And in some ways, these two stories come out of the nature of Israel itself, and out of the nature of the Bible itself. That the Bible was, of course, written by the educated elite in the cities because they were the people who had access to pens and papers and then could write and things like that, and had the time to sit down and write this stuff. But at its core, Israel is a bunch of farmers. Israel was a bunch of farmers, right? Sort of. Anyway, right, so that the agriculture was pretty much the only way to create any sort of livelihood or to even survive in Israel. There wasn't mining and there wasn't trade and there wasn't a lot of commerce and there was not very much fishing going on. And so it was pretty much farming. And so these sort of basic agricultural concerns were a big part of the way Israel thought about the world. But it was even more complicated than that. Part of the story that we sort of often have in our heads, if you grew up in Sunday school, going to church and stuff like that, is you have the Joshua story in your head. The idea that Israel was in the wilderness and then they came into the land and they wiped out all the peoples that were there. We don't like to talk about that, of course, right? But then they had, again, dominion over the land, and they had a free land that was, sitting before them, and they could do whatever they wanted to with it, and they had control over it. And then the book of Judges comes along, and the first couple of chapters of Judges say, oh, by the way, that story didn't really happen. Right, so this is not me disagreeing with Joshua. This is Judges disagreeing with Joshua. Right, so don't blame me for this. But what Judges comes along and says, and again, this is tricky because we don't automatically know this kind of geography in detail, and no one expects you to, right? But Judges comes along and says, well, yeah, we got the hill country, but we didn't get any of the valleys. Right? So sometimes we do this picture in church here of Israel. So here, right? So if you imagine this being the Jordan River, right, and this being the hill country, of Israel, and then that being the Mediterranean Sea on the other side of the wall there. Right? And so you can see here, right, nice flat area for farming. If you're a farmer, this is what you want. Right? And maybe there's some spaces in between the pews once in a while, you know, for a valley where there's some flat land in there, but it's, you know, it's sort of tenuous. And then on the other side of the pews, again, a nice flat area over there beside the Mediterranean, right? And you could farm that, but, you know, along the benches isn't where you'd want to put your garden, right? Well, that's Israel, right? And Judges comes along and says, all of these bumpy parts, that's the part we got. And all of these nice, broad, flat valleys, the Canaanites had all of those. It's sort of this odd reversal for modern Israel. Right? Modern Israel, most of the Jews live in the valleys, and they have all the good land, and the Palestinians and the Arabs are in the hillside. Right? Used to be just the opposite. Okay? So this means that if Israel is the farmers in the hill country, again, for West Virginians, not very hard to think through. Right? The Canaanites had the Ohio River Valley, right? They had the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. They had the nice, you know, the nice land that's pretty much everywhere else except West Virginia, and Israel had West Virginia. Right? And the land in much of Israel isn't even as good as West Virginia. Because we have something here called topsoil. Not very much and not very good, but it's there. And Israel basically is just rock. Like those hillsides that you see on pictures of Israel, basically just rock. And so farming rock is tricky. And while they came into this land and they said, oh, this is a land flowing with milk and honey, that milk and honey was always in danger of being washed down the valley in the next big rain, which were few and far between. And so this is Israel's predicament. It's very precarious, their existence in the early days and ongoing. And this meant that they had to develop a social, economic, religious system that sort of was for people living on the edge. It was for people living on the edge of survival. And it meant that you couldn't really allow for a lot of wealth. Because the moment you had, right, they understood economics as what's called a zero-sum game. And a zero-sum game is where anytime somebody wins, somebody else loses. Because there's only so and so much of something, right? Because they're farmers. There's only so and so much land. If somebody has a lot of land, that means that a lot of other people have none. Right? If there's only one pie, and Dave takes 3 pieces, the rest of us aren't going to get much. Right? That's the way they understood the world, because that was their world. There was only so and so much land, and most of it wasn't very good. There was only so and so much food, and it was always in danger of flowing down the valleys. And so they developed an entire system devoted to the survival of the largest number of people. Right? And it was right, and just really railed against the accumulation of wealth, because the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few meant poverty for a lot of other people. And so, right, the way this relates to us today is to understand pollution not as, right, a bunch of little people making little decisions, but in a lot of ways as a result of systemic greed. Because the people in West Virginia who can't drink their water often aren't the ones who followed their water. Right? It's the big company that came in and dumped the stuff into the river that made it, right? Or abandoned the mine after they were done with it. All of these things, right? So that's what the 2 Kings passage is doing in there, the Elisha story. That I think this is the only story in the Bible that actually deals with pollution. Now, I challenged my wife on this yesterday. Did you think of another pollution story in the Bible?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay, well, she's working on it.
Old Testament, right? New Testament.
There's New Testament pollution stories? Okay, I'll believe you.
Revelation.
Okay, maybe. Right? So anyway, this is a story of Jericho. And Jericho's sitting on the edge of the valley here. Right? And the way we understand this story, the best best explanation I've seen for this story is that Jericho is sort of on the edge of the valley, looking over this broad, beautiful river valley, and the spring that they were using for their water was just below the city. Now, in an ancient city, they weren't very big. 1,000 people, 2,000 people would have been a significant city in Israel. But again, 1,000 people, small area, no sewage system. Right? So which way does the sewage run? Well, it always runs downhill. Right? It isn't just the milk and honey that was flowing downhill in Israel. There was other stuff too. Right? So if you got your city up here and your spring down there, they're going, whoa, you know, our water is not good. Right? And the land, you know, and so Elisha comes along, the great prophet, and says, boo, I'll just fix this problem for you. Now Israel saw the problem in this too. And the problem in this system is what do you do if you don't have a prophet? Because most of Israel didn't have a prophet handy. Elisha just happened to be living in town, right? And, you know, and so he could do this, but what about all the other towns? What about everybody else? And when Elisha dies, there's no prophet to take his place. And so, like, what do you do? Right? So, like, we have that system, and today, of course, we have a different system. Right? And most of that work is now done by science. And that's fine, because the prophet system wasn't working very well. And so we have this new system for a way of dealing with that. But in defense of the old system, it's also worth saying that we live in a city full of scientists, in a nation full of scientists, and yet huge numbers of people in West Virginia could still say the location of this city is good, but the water is bad and the land is unproductive. Right? So in as much as we have all of these scientists, we still have those problems. Anyway, I'm not going to get too far into this argument. Right? But again, right, what's going on here, right, is the need to create a system. Right? It's not just a matter of do we all do our individual recycling, right? All good stuff. But if we have a system that's dedicated to overconsumption, that's dedicated to more and more stuff and more disposable and more greed, right, it's going to create pollution no matter how many pieces of plastic we stuff into bottles and make benches with. And this is all good work. But if our system doesn't get changed, the pollution is going to continue. Jesus believed the same thing. So he tells this story of the rich man and Lazarus. What's interesting about the story of the rich man and Lazarus in this context is that the rich man goes and he dies and he goes to hell. And as far as the text is concerned, the only reason he goes to hell is because he's rich. And the only reason Lazarus goes to be with Moses is because he's poor. So Jesus in this story isn't saying heaven is the great reward. He's saying heaven is the great reversal. And insofar as Jesus also prayed, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? Jesus is looking for a systemic change, right? Where those who are causing the problem, which tends to be the rich because they're the ones who have the big companies that can, right, throw the chemicals into the land, not always. So this is our sermon this morning, right? Because we all know that this stuff matters to God. But, you know, as we think through these things in Earth Day, the Bible wants to remind us that systems are important. That yes, we should go home and recycle, and we should go home and do our little bit, right? But as long as we live in a system dedicated toward greed and wealth creation and economic growth, our problems are only going to grow. And so part of the task here is to try to be part of, to live in, and to hopefully create this new system that this ancient book still points us toward. Amen. Our closing hymn